If you walk out that door tonight, don't expect to come back, my son said from the far end of the dining table, while everyone else stared into their wine glasses like silence could erase what was happening. The chandelier above us cast a warm golden light across the old oak table, but the room felt colder than any winter I could remember. Harrison Manor had stood on that hill outside Boston for nearly 90 years, and for most of my life, every important moment in this family had happened inside that dining room. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, funeral receptions, business deals whispered over bourbon after midnight. Now it was becoming the place where my own family decided I no longer belonged. Isabel sat beside David in a cream silk dress, slowly pouring wine into crystal glasses without looking at me once. She had perfected that expression over the years. Calm, elegant, untouchable, like she was above conflict even while standing at the center of it. Ethan stood near the staircase, his jaw tense, watching everyone carefully. He was the only one in the room who looked uncomfortable. Eleanor remained seated beneath the chandelier with both hands folded tightly in her lap, avoiding eye contact with me entirely. That hurt more than David's words. My wife had once promised we would leave this world together. Tonight she couldn't even look at me. The board agrees this is the best decision, David finally added, loosening his tie like the pressure in the room was suffocating him. You've been out of touch for years, Dad. The company needs stability. I nodded slowly as if I were considering his argument for the first time, even though I had known this dinner was coming for months. Isabel had been preparing him carefully, whisper by whisper, signature by signature. Little by little, she turned my own son into a man who believed removing his father was leadership. James stood silently near the fireplace holding a silver serving tray, but I noticed the look in his eyes. He knew. Thomas had warned me this family would eventually mistake silence for weakness. I folded my napkin carefully beside my untouched steak and stood from the table without raising my voice. Once, nobody stopped me. Nobody asked me to stay. The only sound in the room was rain tapping softly against the tall mansion windows. I reached into the pocket of my old denim jacket and wrapped my fingers around the small brass key I had taken from the library an hour earlier. Then I looked at David one last time and gave him a tired smile. You think tonight is the end of something, I said quietly, but it's only the part you were allowed to see. Rain followed me all the way down the long gravel driveway of Harrison Manor that night. I did not look back at the house even once. After 43 years, I already knew every window, every stone column, every crack in the marble fountain near the entrance. Some places stop feeling like home long before you leave them. The windshield wipers moved slowly across the glass of my old truck as Boston disappeared behind me mile after mile. David probably believed I was driving towards some lonely retirement apartment arranged quietly by Isabel. That was the story they wanted. The old man finally stepping aside with dignity. The truth was much more complicated. 2 hours later, I pulled up outside a weathered lakeside cabin hidden deep in western Massachusetts. The porch light flickered weakly against the storm while pine trees swayed in the darkness around the property. I had bought the place 30 years ago before the company ever became a national name. Back then, it was the only thing I owned outright. Nobody in the family ever cared enough to ask why I kept paying taxes on it all these years. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedarwood, old coffee, and cold stone. I set my bag near the fireplace and carefully placed the brass key on the kitchen counter beside a faded photograph of David at 12 years old, holding his first baseball glove. There was a time my son used to wait by the front door every Friday night just to hear my truck pull into the driveway. Somewhere between wealth and legacy, that boy disappeared. I had barely poured myself a cup of coffee when headlights appeared outside the cabin windows. James stepped out of a black sedan, holding an umbrella against the rain. Even after midnight, he still wore his dark suit and polished shoes like he had walked directly out of the dining room. I figured you would come here, he said quietly after entering the cabin. I nodded toward the chair across from me. How bad was it after I left? James loosened his tie slightly before answering. Nobody spoke for almost 10 minutes. Ethan tried asking questions. Isabel shut him down immediately. That did not surprise me. Isabel controlled conversations the same way some people controlled stock markets. Slowly, invisibly. And David? I asked. James looked toward the fire before speaking. He kept staring at your empty chair. Silence settled between us for a moment while rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. Then James reached into his coat pocket and slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. I recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. "He said you need to read it tonight," James said carefully, "before Isabel realizes what is missing from the library." I stared at the envelope for several long seconds without touching it. Then I finally smiled for the first time that night. Because the moment Isabel started searching for what I took, the real war inside the Harrison family would finally begin. The envelope remained unopened beside my coffee for nearly 20 minutes while the fire cracked softly inside the stone fireplace. James sat quietly across from me without speaking. He understood something most people never did. Silence reveals more than conversation ever will. Outside, dawn slowly pushed through the storm clouds covering the lake, turning the dark water gray beneath the pine trees. Harrison Manor was probably waking up by now. Isabel would already be organizing meetings. David would be pretending he slept well. Eleanor would stand alone in the kitchen staring at the empty chair at the end of the dining table. And somewhere inside that enormous house, somebody had finally discovered the ledger was gone. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter from Thomas. His handwriting looked rushed for the first time in 40 years. "Harrison, if you are reading this, it means Isabel has moved sooner than we expected. Do not trust the board. 3 members were paid through shell accounts connected to Blackmere Holdings. Ethan has started noticing irregularities in the trust documents. Sophia Bennett can help him, but only if he reaches her before Isabel does. Burn everything else after reading this." I read the letter twice before setting it beside the fire. Blackmere Holdings. Isabel had hidden behind that company name for years. Charities, real estate acquisitions, offshore investments. Always legal on paper. Always impossible to trace directly back to her. David probably still believed she was protecting the family. The poor fool had no idea he was slowly signing away everything his grandfather built. James leaned forward slightly. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly. "Ethan went into the library after everyone left dinner last night. That caught my attention immediately." "Why?" James hesitated. "He noticed Isabel checking the shelves after you walked out. She was looking for something specific." I stared into the flames without speaking. Ethan had always been sharper than the rest of them. Even as a child, he noticed details nobody else saw. The way people looked at each other before they lied. The slight pause before someone changed a subject. He got that from me. "Did he find anything?" I finally asked. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He found this hidden behind the 3rd shelf in the West study. I unfolded the paper slowly. My jaw tightened the moment I saw the account numbers written across the page in Isabel's handwriting. Transfers, dates, signatures. Millions of dollars quietly moved through Blackmere Holdings over the last 18 months. At the bottom of the page was one sentence written in black ink. "Once Harrison is removed, the final transfer can proceed." I leaned back slowly in my chair while the cabin fell silent again. Then I looked toward the lake as the first sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Isabel believed she was watching an old man disappear. She still did not understand she had just stepped directly into the trap I spent 2 years building for her. By noon, the rain had completely disappeared, leaving the lake unnaturally still beneath a pale gray sky. I spent most of the morning sitting alone on the cabin porch with Thomas's letter folded inside my jacket pocket, while old memories drifted through my mind like ghosts I had spent years trying to ignore. People love pretending old money is built through elegance and tradition. It is not. It is built through exhaustion, through sacrifice, through years nobody sees. When I founded Harrison Steel Logistics at 31, I drove deliveries myself across 3 states because I could not afford employees. I slept in truck stops, ate cold sandwiches from gas stations, missed birthdays, missed anniversaries. Eleanor used to bring David to the warehouse every Sunday afternoon while I checked inventory. My son would sit on wooden pallets wearing those oversized headphones he loved while pretending to help me sort invoices. Back then, he used to look at me like I was invincible. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Wealth has a strange way of rewriting history inside families. The harder your life was, the more future generations assume everything was simply handed to you. By the time David graduated from Yale, people had already started treating me like some outdated relic from another era. Isabel encouraged it quietly. She never insulted me directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, She smiled patiently whenever I spoke during board dinners, corrected small details in front of investors, reorganized meetings without telling me. Little things. Tiny humiliations spread carefully over years until everyone slowly adjusted to seeing me as unnecessary. Even Eleanor changed. Not openly, never cruelly, but distance crept into her voice over time, like winter settling into an old house. Sometimes I would catch her watching Isabel with an expression I could never fully understand. Fear mixed with admiration, as if part of her knew exactly what kind of woman had entered this family, but she no longer had the strength to stop it. Around 3 in the afternoon, an old black SUV pulled into the dirt driveway outside the cabin. I recognized Ethan immediately stepping out from the passenger side, wearing a dark wool coat with his hands shoved deep into his pockets against the cold wind coming off the lake. Sophia Bennett climbed out beside him carrying a leather briefcase. Younger than I remembered. Sharp eyes. Controlled posture. The kind of lawyer who listened more than she spoke. Ethan hesitated before approaching the porch. "Grandpa," he said quietly. "Not Harrison. Not sir. Grandpa." Strange how one honest word can still mean something after everything else falls apart. I looked at Sophia. "Thomas sent you." She nodded once. He believes Isabel accelerated the timeline after the board vote. Ethan stepped closer, then lowered his voice. "She has people inside the company destroying records already." I stared at him carefully for several seconds before speaking. "Tell me something honestly, Ethan. Why are you really here?" His jaw tightened slightly. Then he looked back toward the lake before answering. "Because you were the only person in that house who never lied to me." The sun disappeared early behind heavy clouds that evening, covering the lake in shadows long before dinner time. Inside the cabin, Sophia spread documents carefully across the old pine table, while Ethan paced slowly near the windows with both hands in his coat pockets. The room smelled faintly of coffee, cedarwood, and fireplace smoke. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Every paper on that table carried the same message in different forms. Isabel had not simply planned to remove me from Harrison Steel Logistics. She had been dismantling the entire foundation of the family itself. "These transfers started 18 months ago," Sophia finally said, sliding one folder toward me. "At first they looked like ordinary investment reallocations. But once we tracked Blackmere Holdings through Delaware and the Cayman accounts, the pattern became obvious." I studied the pages quietly beneath the warm cabin light. Millions moved gradually through shell corporations connected to properties Isabel controlled privately. Art purchases, luxury development projects, political donations, all hidden behind legal structures complicated enough to discourage questions. David signed most of the approvals himself. That was the tragic part. My son believed he was expanding the company. In reality, he was slowly surrendering it piece by piece. Ethan stopped pacing and looked toward me carefully. Did Dad know any of this? The disappointment in his voice felt heavier than anger. I closed the folder slowly before answering. No, David only saw what Isabel allowed him to see. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Deep down, he already understood that. People like Isabel never destroy families openly. They reshape them quietly until nobody recognizes what has been lost. Sophia reached into her briefcase again and removed a second folder sealed with a blue ribbon. "Thomas wanted you to have this personally," she said. I untied the ribbon carefully and immediately recognized my father's handwriting covering the first page. Old ink, old paper, old secrets. Ethan stepped closer beside me while I read silently. The documents detailed the original family trust created nearly 50 years earlier, long before David was even born. Hidden beneath the legal language was one sentence Thomas had highlighted in red. "In the event leadership succession threatens the preservation of the Harrison legacy, controlling authority may bypass direct inheritance at the discretion of the founder." Ethan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" I looked up from the papers and met his eyes for the first time since he arrived at the cabin. "It means your great-grandfather built a safeguard into the family before he died." Sophia folded her hands calmly. "Your grandfather never truly lost control of the company, Ethan. Legally, the final authority was never tied to the board." Silence filled the cabin again while the fire cracked softly behind us. Then Ethan slowly turned toward me with an expression I had not seen inside Harrison Manor in many years. "Hope. So Isabel does not actually own anything yet," he whispered. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the dark lake outside the window while the wind moved through the pine trees. "No," I said quietly. "She only thinks she does." The cabin was completely silent except for the low crackling of the fire and the distant wind pressing against the lake outside. Ethan stood near the window without moving, staring into the dark water as if it might reveal answers on its surface. Sophia remained seated at the table, carefully organizing the documents into separate stacks labeled with thin handwritten notes. I watched both of them for a moment before speaking, my voice calm but deliberate. If Isabel believes she is about to finalize control of the company, then she will make her next move within 48 hours. Ethan turned immediately. "How do you know that?" I leaned forward slightly and placed my hands together on the table. "Because people like Isabel do not wait when they believe victory is already guaranteed. They rush. They expose themselves." Sophia glanced up from the files. "Then we need to be inside Harrison Manor before that happens." I nodded once. "We will be." Ethan frowned. "They do not want you there." I gave a quiet smile, not cold, not warm, just certain. They do not get to decide that anymore. The firelight shifted across the room as the wind outside grew stronger. For a moment, I thought about David as a child again, sitting on the floor of that same mansion drawing lines across business reports he could not yet understand. I thought about Eleanor standing beside me in the kitchen once, laughing softly when the oven broke and we had to finish dinner over a portable stove. Those memories did not feel distant. They felt misplaced, like they belonged to a version of the family that no longer existed. Sophia closed the final folder and looked at me directly. "There is something else," she said carefully. "Isabel has already scheduled a board emergency meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 in the city office." Ethan straightened. "That is too soon. They are accelerating everything." I stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the lake reflected the cabin lights in broken lines across the water. "Then we will arrive before the meeting begins," I said. Ethan hesitated. "And David?" I paused for a moment, watching the dark shoreline. "David will have to decide which version of his life he wants to believe," I said quietly. "The one Isabel wrote for him, or the one he has been too afraid to see." Sophia gathered her briefcase and stood. "I can prepare the filings tonight. If we move early tomorrow, we can stop the transfer before it is executed." I turned back toward them both. Ethan looked uncertain, but there was something stronger beneath it now. Resolve. He was no longer just watching a family fall apart. He was beginning to understand he was standing at the center of something much larger. I reached for my coat hanging near the door. "Then we leave at sunrise," I said calmly. The fire behind me burned steady, reflecting off the glass and filling the cabin with a quiet orange glow, as if even the house itself understood that the silence before the storm had finally ended. We left the cabin before sunrise, the air outside still heavy with the last traces of night and the smell of wet pine from the lake. Ethan sat in the back seat of the black SUV without speaking, staring at the passing trees as if memorizing every shadow. Sophia was beside me in the front, reviewing printed filings and quietly marking pages with a pen. The road toward Boston felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of everything waiting at the end of it. Harrison Manor came into view just after 7 in the morning, its stone walls pale under the gray sky, untouched and imposing as always. To most people it looked like power. To me it looked like memory layered over memory, some of it still intact, most of it already rewritten by people who thought I was gone. James was waiting at the side entrance as planned. He opened the door without a word and handed me a thin folder. "Everything is still in motion inside," he said quietly. Isabel arrived at 6:45. David is already in the office wing. I nodded once and stepped inside. The hallway felt colder than I remembered, the silence deeper, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Ethan followed closely behind me while Sophia moved ahead toward the private boardroom. We did not use the main entrance. We did not announce ourselves. We simply entered like something that had never left. Inside the boardroom, voices stopped immediately the moment we appeared in the doorway. Isabel was standing at the head of the table dressed in a light gray suit, perfectly composed, her expression controlled but alert. David sat to her right, papers in front of him, eyes fixed on the screen displaying financial projections. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then Isabel smiled softly, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. I thought you had already made your decision to retire peacefully, she said, her tone calm but sharpened at the edges. I stepped forward slowly and placed my hands on the back of an empty chair. Retire, I repeated quietly. That is an interesting way to describe being removed from something I built. David looked up immediately, confusion breaking through his professional composure. Dad, this is not what you think. The board has already voted. Ethan moved slightly closer behind me, watching every face in the room. Sophia placed the sealed documents on the table without a word. Isabel glanced at them, then back at me, her confidence still intact, but less certain than before. Even if there are concerns, she said carefully, this meeting is procedural at this stage. I looked at her for a long moment before responding. Then you will not mind reviewing what has been missing from your procedures. The room fell silent again as Sophia opened the first file and placed it under the overhead light. David's expression changed slowly as he began to read. Isabel did not move, but her hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table. For the first time, the balance in the room was no longer hers to control. The room did not explode with chaos. It shifted instead, like a heavy structure finally losing its balance. The silence after Sophia placed the documents on the table felt heavier than any raised voice could have been. David was the first to break it, his eyes scanning page after page as if trying to find a mistake that would save him from what he was seeing. This cannot be accurate, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Isabel finally moved, sliding a step closer to the table, her eyes narrowing as she read the header of the financial report. For the first time since I had known her, her composure had a fracture in it. Not visible to everyone yet, but visible to me. Ethan stood behind my right shoulder, watching every reaction without speaking. Sophia turned another page, pointing at a line of documented transfers. These transactions were not authorized through the correct board channels, she said calmly. They were routed through intermediary accounts tied to Blackmere Holdings. David looked up at Isabel immediately. You told me these were standard restructuring operations, he said, confusion mixing with disbelief. Isabel responded slowly, carefully choosing each word. They were necessary adjustments to stabilize long-term assets. Her tone was smooth, but her eyes no longer matched it. That was when Eleanor entered the room. She had not been present when we arrived. She stopped at the doorway, seeing all of us gathered around the table, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to step back out of the room entirely. But she did not. She walked in slowly and stood near the far end of the table, avoiding everyone's gaze. Eleanor, David said, his voice lower now. Did you know about any of this? She did not answer immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the strap of her handbag. Isabel turned toward her, watching carefully, as if measuring how much truth might spill out next. Finally, Eleanor spoke. I knew enough, she said softly. Enough to understand that things were being changed without transparency. David shook his head in disbelief. Changed by who? He asked. Eleanor hesitated, then looked directly at Isabel for the first time. The silence that followed was enough of an answer. Ethan stepped forward slightly, breaking the tension. So what happens now? He asked. His voice was steady, but there was something new in it. Responsibility. Sophia closed the final folder. Now the legal authority shifts back to the original trust structure, she said, which was never fully dissolved. Isabel exhaled slowly, finally losing the perfect calm she had maintained since the beginning. You are trying to undo years of established governance based on outdated clauses, she said sharply. I looked at her then, not with anger, but with something far more controlled. No, I replied quietly. We are correcting years of quiet manipulation that you believed no one would ever trace. For the first time, Isabel did not respond immediately. David sat back in his chair, the papers still in his hands, realizing that everything he believed he was building had already been rewritten long before he touched it. And in that moment, the power he thought he had inherited began to slip away completely. The boardroom did not feel like a place of power anymore. It felt like a place where power was being reevaluated in real time. The documents on the table were no longer just evidence. They were a mirror forcing everyone in the room to confront what they had ignored for years. David remained seated, his hands resting on the edge of the folder as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Isabel stood perfectly still, but the confidence she had carried when we entered was no longer intact. It was restrained, controlled, and visibly under pressure. Ethan had not moved from my side. His eyes shifted between every reaction in the room, absorbing every detail as if he was seeing the family he thought he knew for the first time. Eleanor finally stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady in a way that surprised even herself. "This was never supposed to become like this," she said. Isabel turned toward her immediately. "Then why did you allow it to happen?" she asked, her tone sharper now, no longer carefully composed. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes dropping for a brief moment before she answered. "Because I thought I was protecting stability," she said softly. "I thought keeping things quiet was safer than exposing what was wrong." David leaned forward, his voice breaking through the tension. "So you knew there were problems and said nothing?" Eleanor looked at him, pain flickering across her face. "I did not understand the full extent," she replied. "Not until it was already too late." Sophia placed another document on top of the stack. "At this point," she said calmly, "the question is no longer what was done, but what authority remains valid moving forward." Isabel finally moved away from the table, walking slowly toward the large windows at the end of the room. Outside, the city skyline stretched across the morning light, distant and indifferent. "You are all acting as if one interpretation of a trust document can undo years of corporate structure," she said without turning around. I followed her with my eyes, but did not raise my voice. "It is not interpretation," I said quietly. "It is what was always written and never fully erased." Ethan stepped forward slightly. "Then what happens to the company now?" he asked. His voice carried uncertainty, but also a growing sense of responsibility that had not been there before. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "That depends on who understands what this family was meant to be and who was simply benefiting from what it became." Isabel turned back toward us slowly. For the first time, there was no confidence left in her expression, only calculation. She was no longer controlling the room. She was trying to understand how she had lost it. David remained silent, staring at the documents in front of him, realizing that the foundation of everything he believed he inherited had never been as solid as he thought. And in that silence, the structure of the Harrison family did not collapse, but it changed shape permanently, as if the truth had finally taken its place at the center of everything.